On behalf of Perth and Kinross Heritage Trust and the Perth City Heritage Fund, welcome to our fifth session of the 2021 Architectural Conservation CPD programme. If you have attended previous talks, welcome back, and if you are here for the first time, thank you for joining us. By way of introduction for new members, we've been delivering Architectural Conservation CPDs since 2018 to help make training in conservation theory, best practice and principles easily accessible to professionals, property owners and students alike. The programme forms part of Perth and Kinross Heritage Trust's ongoing work to preserve, enhance and increase understanding of this region's historic environment. It is delivered in conjunction with the Perth City Heritage Fund, which is a scheme supported by Historic Environment Scotland, offering grant assistance to homeowners with the aim of encouraging the regeneration of Perth's historic buildings using traditional materials and skills and in accordance with best conservation practice. You can find out more about the Trust and the City Heritage Fund by visiting our website or browsing our annual report, which you'll also find there. We hope you find today's session of interest and that it helps encourage best conservation practice and sustainable futures for traditional and historic buildings. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Daniele Muir to deliver our talk today. Daniele is from Perthshire and has both a lifelong love of nature and a professional background in environmental and countryside management, with over 20 years' experience of working in the environmental field. With an excellent knowledge of Scottish wildlife, a degree in environmental science and a master's in sustainability, she has worked as a wildlife guide, Swift Conservation Project Officer, Scottish Dragonfly Officer and Countryside Ranger. She is leader of the Tayside Swifts Group and one of the co-founders of the Tayside Amphibian and Reptile Group. Daniele set up Perthshire Wildlife in 2013, which is a consultancy service for ecological and sustainability projects. Daniele also leads guided walks with a first aid and lowland walking leader qualifications, although I trust neither of these will be called on today. I can think of no one better to deliver today's session on ecology and traditional buildings. So Daniele, over to you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Sarah, and yes, thank you everybody for coming along today. Sarah was saying we've got really good numbers to learn a bit about ecology and traditional buildings. So Sarah gave me a lovely introduction there. Yeah, I run Perthshire Wildlife, really busy at this time of the year with beaver tours, but I'm also involved in a couple of Swift conservation projects at the moment, one in Crieff and one in Forfar. And yeah, over the years, I've been involved in a number of building and biodiversity projects, often with an emphasis on swifts. And I'm, as Sarah was saying, co-leader of the Tayside Swifts Group, which was set up about 15 years ago as a sort of umbrella group for helping out with swift projects across the area and also for offering advice. So there is a bit of an emphasis on swifts here, but I've also included other wildlife because obviously it's not just swifts that are found around traditional buildings. So we're going to cover a wide range of different species. We're going to look at how to identify those species and look at where they might be living. We'll touch on the legislation relating to wildlife, and we'll also look at how to manage your property for wildlife staying within the law. And we've got a number of examples of local work and also work from further afield, which we'll show, and a little video to finish off at the end as well. So the wildlife that we're going to be looking at includes birds. Species that use buildings include swifts, swallows, house martins, starlings, house sparrows and barn owls, though there will be more, I'm sure. But these are probably the ones that people come across most. We're going to look at bats and pine martins, and we're also including mason bees because mason bees they're wonderful pollinators, and we can do quite a lot to help solitary bees such as mason bees. So starting off with birds. So swifts are, in my opinion, one of the most amazing amazing birds on the planet. So swifts are very aerial birds. Their whole sort of physiology is related to their aerial lifestyle. And you can see from this picture here, and this picture was taken by Martin Ridley, the wildlife artist who lives in Comrie, and he's got a wonderful swift colony at his house, and he keeps adding to it and managing to get more swifts nesting there. He's raised a few chicks to fledging that have fallen out of the nest, or if their parents haven't managed to return for whatever reason. And this is one that that just before fledging he took this photo, and it's just a great photo to illustrate the way that swifts are designed, because they spend so much of their time in the air. They've got these lovely long slim wings, very strong wings, fairly short, stocky, muscular body. They've got quite close set eyes. They've got a very small sort of bullet shaped head. They've got quite a small beak, basically so that they're very streamlined while they're flying. So why should we help the swifts? Well, swifts have been part of the built environment for a very long time. So they used to nest in sort of old trees that were rotting. So quite often in old woodpecker nest holes. And ever since we first started putting up buildings about 2,000 years ago, swifts have converted to using our buildings as we've cut down our forests. So there are still a few tree nesting swifts in Abernethy National Nature Reserve near Aviemore. And we were quite lucky to go and visit them a few years ago. We had a guided tour by one of the head staff at the RSPB Reserve. And the way that the swifts live in the trees is completely different to how they live in the urban environment. They move around from the nest sites in the trees every year as the nest sites change over time. Whereas when they're in the urban environment and nesting in buildings, those nest sites don't change, so they're loyal to them for their life. So yeah, they're fascinating birds. I think that their presence improves the quality of our lives. I think the noise that they make is a real brings around a real feeling of well-being. And I've got the sound of some swifts screaming here, so hopefully you'll recognise this sound. Oh dear, my phone seems to be on mute for some reason. Let's see if I can get it to work. No, that's always going to be something that goes wrong. Here we go. Right, you should be able to hear this. But no, it's not working. So I apologize for that. I don't know why. It was working fine 5 minutes ago. Okay, so they make this wonderful screaming noise when they're flying around the buildings where they nest. And it's certainly a noise that takes me back to sort of like warm summer evenings. And definitely brings about a good feeling of well-being. And their numbers have dropped dramatically in recent years, and we'll learn a bit more about that later on. So they are, as I said before, they are amazing birds. They're not related to swallows and martins. Lots of people think that they belong to the same family, but they look quite similar, and they feed on similar prey, but they've sort of evolved. They've evolved along similar lines over millennia, which is sort of called convergent evolution. And swifts, they feed while they're flying, and they feed on various flying insects or airborne spiders. They sleep on the wing, they drink on the wing, they can drink raindrops, and they can even mate on the wing. So you can tell they've got a very, very aerial lifestyle. They can fly up to 500 miles a day. They can fly round about weather systems. If you imagine if it's a cold, if it's a windy and wet day, then there's not going to be much in the way of insects flying around. So the swifts will fly around those weather systems to a drier place. And if you add together all the miles that they do per day, plus their migration twice a year. In their lifetime, they fly far enough to fly to the moon and back 4 times. So there's no other bird flies quite that far. And they only stop to breed. So when you see birds roosting on the wires, sort of in August, September time, none of those will be swifts. House martins, sand martins and swallows, they all roost on wires, but swifts don't. And they migrate to and from southern Africa every year. It's only in recent years that modern technology has enabled scientists to be able to put data loggers on the back of swifts to find out exactly where they're going. So we know that they spend a lot of time over the Congo in Central Africa where the rainforest is, so there's likely to be lots of insects. And then quite often they'll head down to further southeast, around about Mozambique and the north of South Africa and the countries in between. So that's really quite interesting. We find out that when they migrate back to Scotland, they come back very, very quickly. And a swift can cover 1,000 kilometres in 24 hours. So they're flying very fast and very direct on their way back to Scotland to breed. And they breed at 3 or 4 years old to begin with. And if you think about a young swift, once it leaves its nest site, if it breeds at 3 or 4 years old, it won't stop flying in that time until it finds that nest site. So that's 2 or 3 or even 4 years without stopping. So absolutely amazing. So I've included some pictures of swallows here. So swallows are found round about buildings, especially traditional buildings. You'll quite often find them in sort of garages or sheds or barns, stables, that kind of thing. And swallows are, they're white underneath, as you can see from the picture on the left. So compared to the picture we saw before of the swift, which swifts are sooty brown all over with just a little white pale patch on their throat. So swallows are pale underneath. They have that lovely red patch just underneath their bill. They have sort of navy blue feathers on the back and very long tail streamers. And their nest is it's an open cup, really. So we can see here it's quite muddy and it's mixed in with straw and hay as well. And it's open at the top. So you can see the little swallows just along the top there. And they're just about to fledge, I would imagine. So we'll compare that nest to, we're going to look at a house martin nest in a second. Now, I said before, swifts are loyal to the same nest site and they return there every year with the same mate. And they're in Scotland for just over 3 months. So they arrive usually in the first week in May. Sometimes if the weather's cold or if something's going on a bit further to the south, it can be into the second week of May. And that was certainly the case this year. I think it had been very cold and they didn't arrive till about the 10th of May this year. And they're here until usually early to mid-August, depending on what the weather's been like and how quickly the young have fledged and so on. And they need to nest high up to get easily airborne, and this is essentially to do with their physiology. They've got the long, thin wings, but they've got very short legs, and that means if the young ones, when they fledge, if they don't manage to get away straight away, if they end up on the ground, then it can be quite difficult for them to get airborne. So they need to be nesting high up so that the young ones can quickly get away. So we've got here pictures of house martins, and you can see from the picture on the left, it's quite a stocky bird. It's also sort of navy blue and white, though it doesn't have any red on it like the swallow does. They've got quite a stumpy forked tail, much shorter than the swallows, and they've got this very obvious white rump there. And the picture on the right hand side, you can see a house martin in its nest, and these nests are basically the muddy cups with just a small entrance for the parent birds to feed the chicks. And they don't have the sort of straw and hay in them that the swallow nests do. And quite often you'll find them as sort of in the apex of the eaves of a building. So they're definitely associated with the traditional buildings, but they are found in more modern buildings as well, where they can fit the mud onto the building. Quite often when there's plastic, then it's difficult to fix the mud onto plastic surrounds. This is at one of the buildings at the business park, Orchard Bank Business Park at Forfar, where I was doing a Swift survey. There'd been lots of Swift boxes put up there, and I was just checking to see if any of them were being used. There's none being used by Swifts as far as I could tell, but there were quite a few being used by house martins. So this was quite an interesting picture. The house martins are using the back of the Swift box to build their muddy cup. And there was something else that I'd never seen before that I saw there. The house martins were actually going into the Swift nest box and nesting in the Swift nest box, which is a first for me. So the Swifts may not be using them, but starlings were using the boxes, and the house martins were too. So that's good. So the scientific name for a swift is Apis apis, and that means no feet. Of course, they do have feet, but they've got very, very short legs, which is again to do with the time that they spend in the air. And swifts are the only species of birds whose young can survive a period of torpor during food shortages. So this is related to how they're so reliant on sort of airborne insects and spiders. If it's cold and wet and rainy for a few days, then the parent birds aren't going to be able to find any food. So the young go into a sort of mini hibernation, their heart rate slows down, their breathing slows down. So they're using a very minimal amount of energy, and that helps to sort of tide them through to when the weather improves and the parents can come back with some food again. So the pictures here are of sand martins, which don't tend to be found in urban areas, but they are found in some, certainly they nest along the Lade in Perth. So they can be distinguished from swifts by they've got they're lighter brown, and they're also pale underneath, but they nest in sandy banks alongside rivers and lochs and so on. And you can see the picture on the right here. I took that close to the River Ericht near Blairgowrie. You can see some of the holes in the bank, and they burrow out about a metre into the bank and then have their nesting chamber at the end of the burrow. Why do we need to help swifts? Well, you can see from this graph here, which is the Breeding Bird Survey Index for Scotland a few years ago. Over the past 25 years or so, there's been a 62% decline in the breeding population. So that's a serious fall in numbers. So swifts are now on the Conservation Amber List. And it's largely a result of the loss of nesting sites due to building renovation and demolition. And you can see from this picture on the right here, there you can see a swift's wing. It was sitting on the nest. You can see some nesting material there, and was killed when this building was knocked down. And it can be difficult to see where swifts are nesting. So I'm including quite a few pictures of swifts' nests so you can get a feel for them. Part of the reason that swift numbers have dropped as well is there just aren't the insects around that there used to be. So rather than raising maybe three young in a year, swifts maybe manage one or two. So a combination of a number of different things has led to that huge drop in numbers. So the majority of birds do nest in older buildings, and modern building techniques and building regulations do tend to exclude swifts because new buildings now are pretty much sealed for to keep them warm, basically. As I said before, swifts nest high up, for example, under roof tiles and eaves and cracks and crevices, and they like to nest at least 5 metres high so that they can avoid predators as well as the young swifts being able to get away. So this is just a diagram of where swifts nest: under slates, under tiles, on the edge of roof spaces, under eaves, especially under roans. Quite often they'll go under a little gap under the roans, and there's a little gap in the stonework, and they'll just nest on the head wall of the stone. I mean, swifts they don't really have much of a nest. What they do is they'll collect lots of bits of hay and seeds and feathers when they're flying, and their salivary glands double in size during the breeding season, and they stick all of this stuff that they've collected while they're flying, they stick it together into a little sort of cup, and that's what they use as their nest, and they'll lay between 2 to 3 eggs. And they're found in holes in walls as well, but certainly at my house where I have swifts nesting, they go into the little gap between the slates and the wall, and where the pointings come away, and they nest in there. They usually have a fight with the starlings as to who can nest there. This is a photo that I took in Perthshire last summer when I was doing a survey of the town to see which buildings had swifts nesting there. So you can see this is just a little swift chick, probably just about to fledge, summoning up the courage to leave its nest site. And you can see there's a few white splashes just underneath the nest site. That's quite typical. So when I'm doing swift surveys, I'm looking for a little gap in the stonework and a number of white splashes underneath. And this one here, that would have been about 4.5 meters high, I think. This is another one from Perthshire, which is quite messy. I think starlings have been in there. Starlings are quite messy birds at the nest, whereas swifts aren't. But the swift just swooped into that tiny little gap that you can see there in between the wood and the stone. So it can be difficult to find a swift nest site. This is one that my colleague Andrea from Ecology, she found this one just in the gap underneath the slates. So there's probably quite a few little holes along the edge of that wall that swifts would be able to make use of, and bats as well, because bats will use very similar access holes to swifts. Now, the legislation round about wildlife is quite complex. It's spread across several different acts, but key pieces include the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981, Protection of Wild Mammals Scotland Act 2002, and the Nature Conservation Scotland Act 2004. And you can find lots of information about the legislation on the Nature Scot website, which is quite a useful resource. So I remember when the the Act came into play in 2004. The new legislation came into place in 2004, because it added the word recklessly to the legislation. So for any wild bird species, it's an offence to intentionally or recklessly, previously it was just intentionally, kill, injure or take a bird, take, damage, destroy or interfere with the nest of any bird while it's in use or being built. So that means from when, let's say it's a house sparrow, if the house sparrow goes into nest, it's quite an early nester, let's say it goes into a little gap in the stonework on the 4th of March with just a little twig in its beak and puts that down, that's the start of the bird nesting. So the nest is protected from that time onwards. It's an offence to obstruct or prevent any bird from using its nest. So that takes into account if you've got scaffolding and nets on scaffolding on your building. If you have birds nesting a bit higher up, you've just got to make sure that the scaffolding and the nets don't prevent the bird getting in, and to take or destroy an egg of any bird. So it's to stay on the right side of the law and to do the right thing with regards to wildlife as well. If you're planning on carrying out any kind of works on your traditional building, then time these works out with the nesting period. So from early March to late August, I'd say even into late September actually, because there are still swallows and house martins here that are nesting, and we're almost into October. I do remember seeing in October some house martins still feeding their young, and I was thinking, oh gosh, are they going to be okay? Because the instinct to migrate south must be so strong in those house martins. But it's just, I don't know which is the stronger instinct, to keep feeding your babies while you're wanting to migrate south. I hope they were okay. This was a few years ago. So try and retain the existing nest sites wherever possible, but have a look and see if you can improve biodiversity by providing new nest sites. So this picture on the right here, this is part of the Perthshire Swift project, where we put up some nest boxes on in locations where swifts had been observed in screaming parties, so we knew they were nesting close by. And this was at the Tayside Hotel in Stanley, where they had a couple of natural nest sites, but I think wasps were getting in and they were going into the guests' rooms, which obviously weren't very welcome. So they filled in those natural nest sites, and we put up some boxes to replace those. So the swifts readily moved into the one here on the right, but you can see in the picture on the left, there's a cheeky wee house sparrow there looking out. So I think they lost one nest site because the swifts must have gone elsewhere. Unfortunately, both of the boxes aren't being used by swifts. This is a really useful tool if you're looking into doing renovations, or even if new builds as well. It's the Schwegler cavity panel. So you can have a niche in the wall that can be used by swifts or other nesting birds, and it can just be put on the front of the niche. And this can also be painted to blend in with the colour of the building as well. So they're quite cheap and easy to fix, and readily used as well. So nest provision for swifts, it can be achieved at little cost and without compromising the appearance of the building. And remember that swifts they're good neighbours, they're not messy, they're not noisy, they leave very little evidence of their presence at a breeding site. And every new nest site for a swift is really, really important. So looking at house martins, well, we saw the house martin nest is a muddy cup. House martins and swallows can be quite messy, so it might be well worthwhile including a sort of platform underneath the nest site to catch the droppings and putting a bit of cardboard on that, and that can be changed every couple of days. But it's a good picture of the house martin here. You can see what a stocky bird it is in comparison to the swift. So these house martin nest cups, they're made out of something called woodcrete, which is a combination of wood fibre and concrete. And they're very long lasting. They'll last for sort of 50 years or so. If they can be put somewhere where there's an overhang so that the nests are protected, then it would make them last even longer. Swallow nest cups are widely available as well. And again, if they can be put somewhere where there's an overhang so that the nest is protected, then the birds will probably build some, they'll add some mud and some hay into these so it will blend in a bit better with the building. Barn owls, they're strongly associated with traditional buildings, especially agricultural buildings such as barns. And numbers have dropped also due to renovations and as older buildings collapse as well. But it's easy to provide barn owls with nesting spaces within traditional buildings or even new buildings, as there's a variety of boxes on the market that owls will use quite readily, and these can be incorporated into the design inside the building or put on the outside of the building. Starling nest sites, starlings, they'll use the same nest sites as swifts do. In fact, starlings and swifts will actually fight to the death for a nest site. So it's quite good to have extra places for starlings to use away from swift nest sites. And this is a picture of the nest from within the roof space. And if it's quite easy to box off nests like this that are within the roof space so that the birds don't actually get further into the fabric of the house. But there are starling nest boxes that can be put up on both buildings and on trees. So if you do have to carry out some kind of work to your building and end up excluding the starlings, putting some sort of mitigation measures such as nest boxes close by on trees would be the ideal thing to do. And house sparrows, again, they use very similar sites to starlings and swifts, and they start nesting quite early on, as I was saying, and it's possible to encourage house sparrows by putting in house sparrow terraces. And this one at the top here, that's a Schwegler one, and again that can be built into walls if you're doing renovations, or they can be put up on trees as well. Not this design, but there are other designs that can go onto trees. Bats, moving on to bats. All species of bat in the UK are European protected species. And it's not just bats that are European protected species. There's badgers, otters, water voles, great crested newts, red squirrels and pine martens. They all have a good level of protection. So with European protected species, it's an offence to deliberately or recklessly capture, injure or kill a wild animal of a European protected species, to disturb such an animal when it's occupying a structure or place it uses for shelter or protection, to disturb such an animal while it's rearing or otherwise caring for its young, to obstruct access to a breeding site or resting place of such an animal, or to otherwise deny the animal use of the breeding site or resting place, and to damage or destroy a breeding site or resting place of such an animal. So that means that bats and their roosts are protected, even if they're not being used all year round. So if there is a bat present on site, then for any development liable to affect the bats, which is pretty much everything, then it will require licensing by Nature Scot. So what you would be best to do is, if you have bats in your building and you're wanting to make some changes, obviously if it's far away from the bats, then you wouldn't need a license to do that, as it wouldn't affect the bats if it was around, for example, the other side of the building. But if you're working close by, then getting a license and a licensed ecologist would be the ideal thing to do. So the key identification feature of finding bats is the presence of droppings. So they look a bit like mouse droppings. You can see from this picture here, it's it's underneath the entrance to the roost, and these droppings, they're sort of dark brown, between 4 and 8 millimeters long. If you were to crumble them into, they'd sort of disintegrate into a fine powder when they're crushed, as they're made up of like the hard bits of the insect's exoskeleton, whereas mouse droppings would obviously go quite squidgy. And for bats, you can have different kinds of roosts. You can have maternity roosts during the summer, where females will gather together to give birth and look after their babies. You can have hibernation roosts as well, and these are just roosts that bats come in to use at different times of the year. So that needs to be taken into consideration as well. So I've got a couple of slides here of where bats have been getting into buildings. Now, you're going to see a slide which shows you how small a gap pipistrelle bats can get into. But the picture on the top right there, excuse me, you can see that they're getting into the little gap between the stone on the top right and the coping stone that's on top, squeezing into a gap maybe about 2 centimeters high. And the picture on the left, they're squeezing into the little gap between the roof and the tiles on the roof and the timbers itself. So they're very typical places for bats to squeeze in. So this is just a slide of places where bats may use in the building. You can see it's pretty much everywhere, from barge boards to roofing felt to roof joists, broken tiles, spaces between down pipes. A lot of these are quite similar to where swifts go as well. Wooden cladding, end tiles, the eaves, the guttering. And if you look down at the bottom left-hand side of this slide here, you can see that dark area here. That's the size that a pipistrelle bat can squeeze through to enter a building. So you can find them pretty much anywhere in undisturbed spaces in buildings, and in crevices and hollows of trees, of course. That's where they would originally have roosted. So we've got 10 species of bat in Scotland. Our commonest species are pipistrelle bats. We get soprano and common pipistrelle bats, and this pipistrelle here can eat up to 3,000 midges a night. So I do think that we should all be providing homes for bats in our buildings. Just, I mean, look at that. It's just a gorgeous wee beastie. But think of how many more midges we'd have if it wasn't for bats. And probably our third most common species is the brown long-eared bat, which when it goes to sleep, it tucks those long ears up underneath its wings. And again, they eat lots and lots of, they'll eat earwigs, they'll eat moths, they'll eat all sorts of night-flying insects. So when it comes to doing some renovation works, obviously you would need to work with a qualified ecologist to get some advice from them. But there are a few things available on the market that can help bats, such as these bat tiles, which come in different colours. You can see they come in a sort of slate colour, a golden colour, sort of a reddy brown brick colour, and the bats can get under there to roost. There are also bat access bricks, and these are put on longitudinally, and you can see that there's little gaps behind them. So the bats will go in the spaces at the front of the brick, and then they'll roost at the back there, in the space at the back. There are also lots of bat boxes that can go up on trees and on buildings on the exterior. These are 2 that we put up as part of the Cardiff Gowrie Swift Conservation Project, which obviously included putting up, providing homes for bats as well. And these Schwegler Woodcrete boxes on the left-hand side here, bats really do like them because they're made of a mixture of wood fibre and concrete. So they're it's just like the house martin nest cup. So they're long lasting, but they also have fairly constant humidity and temperature in there. Whereas with the wooden ones, there's more of a fluctuation in temperature. And for new builds, if you see on this picture on the left here, this is taken in Stanley, and it's great that the Perth and Kinross planners are putting in as part of their conditions now for new builds that they have to include, there's a swift box on the right hand side there, and there's a bat tube on the left hand side there. So just little things like that can make such a huge difference to wildlife. And that's not a traditional building, but that's Stanley's a swift hotspot, and this means that there's going to be lots of new homes for young swifts to move into as a result of these new builds. And again, this is just an external bat box on a new build on the right hand side as well. So pine martins are European protected species as well. They do prefer woodland habitats, and the natural den sites include tree cavities or round about the root balls of pine trees, but they can be found in roof spaces. Their droppings are the clues that pine martins are there. They're quite curly, and apparently they're violet scented. I've never smelt a violet scented pine martin poo, but apparently they are. I don't know, maybe someone can tell me if they've ever smelt a violet scented pine martin poo. But here's a picture here of some pine martin poo. This is my colleague found. This is obviously on the roofing insulation on the left. And this is a more traditional one on the ground on the right hand side here, but they can be full of all sorts at this time of the year, full of blaeberries or sort of cherry pips. So a license isn't actually needed to disturb pine martins to discourage them from using a house. It is possible to block the access point to a den site in a house as long as there's no pine martin present at the time. So if they're getting in through a small gap, then it's okay to block up that gap as long as there's no pine martins present. If they are denning, then a license is needed to interfere with the den, and it's very unlikely that you would get a license to move a family until after they've left the den. But they will move readily into boxes. So this is a nice picture of a pine martin looking out of its box. And just to have a little bit about bee bricks, obviously bees are pollinators. We rely on pollinators for our foods. We don't have the wildflowers that bees used to, the wildflower meadows that our insects used to feed on. And we don't have sort of the habitat, certainly for bumblebees, that bumblebees used to. Bumblebee numbers have dropped a lot because we don't have the habitat for them to nest in either. But one of the ways we can help solitary bees, such as mason bees, is to provide bee bricks, and they will take readily to these holes in bricks in which to nest. And there's even single bee cells as well. So that's a small single nest site for a solitary bee. And it's made from concrete, 75% of which is recycled from the Cornish China clay works. So that can be built into the brickwork, and red mason and leaf cutter bees will be able to go in there and lay their eggs. So if that's sited in a south-facing location, then that's ideal. It'll warm up and sort of speed up the speed up the development of the bee larvae. So restoration, if buildings are being restored, we've got some examples to have a look at here for swifts, certainly. There's lots of exterior nest boxes for swifts. These Schwegler ones are quite heavy, so I wouldn't really recommend these ones. I would recommend some lighter ones. This Delta box is a bit lighter, but again, this one at the bottom is again quite heavy. And these might not be suitable for traditional buildings, these ones, but they're much cheaper and they're much lighter as well. So at Stanley Village Hall, the Village Hall Committee wanted to, well, they had to repair or replace the roof, and there were a number of swifts nesting in the Village Hall, and they were getting up underneath. You can see that there's a sort of like a panel just above where those nest boxes are. So the swifts were managing to zoom up underneath that panel and then nest just inside on the wall there. So we didn't want to lose those swift nest sites. So the roof was replaced out with the nesting season, and we put up some extra swift boxes for the swifts to nest into, to move into. But in actual fact, the new roof did leave a big enough gap for the swifts to continue using their traditional nest sites, but new ones moved into the other boxes as well. So that was quite a good success story. Perth Concert Hall, it's not a traditional building, but this is just to show what you can do if you want. There's a triple nest box which has had to be strapped on because there's not really any way of fixing it onto that metal strut there. And we've put up lots of swift nest boxes at schools across Perth and Kinross and Angus. And Inchture Church was quite an interesting swift nest site here on the top left-hand side. And we, as part of the Buildings for Biodiversity project, we worked with the builder and the architect to maintain that swift nest site. And there's a little video that I'm going to just show you at the end that goes into it in a bit more detail, but these are just some photographs. So the swifts were flying in, and they were getting into just the left of the gutter there, and then moving along to the right. And this is when the tiles were taken off. This is what we could see. So there's obviously been some sparrows in there bringing in some extra nesting material. This is just looking at the nest site here. And what the builders did was they made this box. We put in some of the existing nesting material. And this was the building afterwards. So you wouldn't know that there was a nest box in there. And the original access was maintained so that the swifts would still feel quite familiar with the nest site. So everyone was happy. Just moving on to the Muir Conservation Area Regeneration Scheme, where the town centre was basically being regenerated to a certain extent. So this was Glengate Hall, which is a traditional building, and it was repointed. But you can see in the centre of that picture there's just a little gap underneath the gutter with some white splashes underneath. So that was a swift nest site, which we managed to keep free of pointing. There was no water getting into the building from there anyway, so it was fine. And what we did on the other side was the builders blocked it off from getting into the roof space by building a plywood nest box on the other side. So again, it cost next to nothing, and it was just a case of knowing where the swifts were and planning for them, which meant it could be achieved quite easily and quite cheaply. Because it was in the conservation area, we had other nest boxes to go up, so we put them in fairly well hidden areas that the swifts would find, and painted the boxes so that they blend in with the sandstone. So this is just round the back of the Glengate Hall, so the nest boxes blended in quite well. And I just included this because it's a wonderful project. So this is in Azerbaijan, in Baku, where they had to work on a tower quite close by, and the swifts weren't able to get access to their nest sites over the summer. So they put up all these nest boxes. These are the Schwegler nest boxes in the shape of a swift. And some of them were used by the swifts. And just a few pictures of traditional buildings elsewhere. This is in the Netherlands, and these are soffit swift boxes. So they're essentially just holes in the soffits that the swifts use. So very easy to do. And some of this, well, quite a lot of this stuff that I've talked about will be in this book, The Biodiversity for Low and Zero Carbon Buildings. So RIBA published this about 10 years ago, and it's brilliant in that it contains practical advice, detailed drawings of designs to accommodate all sorts of wildlife. So there's quite a lot about legislation and policy in there as well. So well worth getting your hands on. So you can find out a bit more information about swifts at these websites. Swift Conservation, Action for Swifts is great. It includes lots of practical advice as well. The Tayside Biodiversity website has lots of information about swifts and what we've been doing to help them over the last 15 years or so. Green and Blue is the company that makes those bead bricks. And there's also a really good Tayside Biodiversity, incorporating biodiversity into development on the Tayside Biodiversity website as well. So that's the end of the presentation. Thanks for listening to that. Hopefully you found it useful. But I'm going to finish off by playing you a video that was made as part of the Buildings for Biodiversity project, which was a Tay Landscape partnership project a few years ago, which I was involved with. So I'll move on to that. So we'll close this down. And onto here. So can you see this? Has it come up with the Tayside swifts? Sarah, can you see that? Is it closed down out of the presentation? It's gone into Vimeo.
Sorry, yes, that was working, Danielle.
Oh, right, okay, right.
I was giving you a thumbs up. I wasn't sure what you'd seen.
I couldn't see. Right, okay, so we'll play that now.
The common swift is a summer visitor to Scotland, arriving in early May and leaving in early August for its wintering areas in southern and central Africa. The sound of swifts in a screaming party where they excitedly fly around the buildings in which they nest is one of the quintessential sounds of summer. Swifts feed on the wing, sleep on the wing, and also mate while flying. They feed on airborne insects and spiders, including mosquitoes, so have a very important pest control role. When nesting, they make next to no mess, so frequently people are unaware that these wonderful birds are nesting in their properties. Originally, they used cliffs, crags, and trees for breeding, but since the Roman times, they've adapted well to using our man-made buildings. Swifts are generally associated with older buildings, where they use the gaps under eaves, gaps in pointing, and cracks in stonework to nest. As older buildings are renovated, these gaps and cracks are filled in, resulting in the loss of nest sites. Since 1993, it's estimated through British Trust for Ornithology surveys that we have lost 62% of our population of swifts. However, it is easy to maintain these swift nest sites with a bit of forward planning. Swifts had nested at Perthshire Church for a number of years. As a member of Eco-Congregation Scotland, the church was keen to conserve their swift nest site while the Grade B listed building underwent complete renovation. Working with the minister, George Martin Builders and JF Stephen Architects, advice was given to maintain the nest site. Pointing started at the far end of the building from the nest, and scaffolding was erected only once the young birds had fledged and the adults left the nest. A ventilated plywood nest box sized 450 mils by 210 mils by 222 mils was made and placed in the same spot as the original nest after removing the roofing slates. The material from the old nest was kept and placed in the box to encourage the swifts to nest again the following year. Access to the rest of the building was then blocked off and the slates were replaced. The necessary pointing was then carried out in the box fronted with stone, so the external wall looked as it did originally. We were very careful to maintain the original access to the nest site, which was a gap at the side of the downpipe. And in addition to this, 2 triple nesting boxes were installed on the north face of the church to help increase the population of swifts in Perthshire. So the solutions were simple, inexpensive, and in keeping with being a registered eco-church. Specially designed nest boxes are another way to help try and increase our swift numbers again. There is now a wide variety of integral swift nest boxes on the market which have been designed to fit in with building standards. Integral nest boxes are preferable to external ones as they need no maintenance and will last longer. Tayside Swifts has worked with a number of developers over the years, and conserving existing swift nest sites can be easily done and at very little cost. The key factor is to include the work at the planning stage. So where do swifts nest, and how can I identify a swift nest site? Well, swifts nest in very restricted spaces, and due to their streamlined shape can squeeze into gaps only a few centimetres in height and width. The nest won't be visible from outside the building, but a white splash below a small gap can sometimes help to give the location away. The birds crawl a short distance from the access point to the location of the nest. Swift nest sites are usually found over 4 or 5 metres high, though not always, and they nest in the following places. Inside eaves, in open eaves under the bottom row of tiles quite frequently, above the gutter just inside the roof space. They'll nest in holes, frequently in holes in walls where downpipes have been removed. Behind flashings, on brick ends, or in holes under loose or missing flashings, or on chimneys and skylights. Inside gables, behind barge boards and gables, on the brick ends. Under tiles, under loose or displaced tiles, on the roof timbers or felt. And also in missing pointing, in voids behind gaps between stones or bricks where the pointing has washed out. What work will affect swifts, and what should we do prior to starting work? Demolition, structural alterations, refurbishment and maintenance work can affect nests in various ways. What to do prior to starting work? Well, consider whether the work will affect the nest sites. If you're carrying out work during the summer between May and August, it's likely that the work will affect the nest sites. Check records, find out if the local authority planning departments, the local biodiversity officers have records of the area where swifts nest. Have a look from the ground for birds flying around and going into small gaps in the building. If you have a look at the eaves level, that might help to find existing nest sites with the little white splashes underneath the gap. If you do find any nest sites, make sure you mark them so that these are conserved. But to be completely sure of nesting status, it's probably going to be worthwhile employing an ecologist to undertake a professional survey. Throughout the summer, groups of swifts can be seen flying around buildings at great speed, making a screaming noise. These screaming parties usually indicate that the swifts are nesting close by. Swifts are amazing birds. After the chicks leave the nest in late July, they won't stop flying for another 3 years until they first start to breed or look for a nest site. In its lifetime, a swift flies far enough to go to the moon and back. We can easily help to increase their populations again by maintaining existing nest sites and incorporating swift nest boxes into new builds. Tayside Swifts can offer advice. Please contact Muir at taysideswifts.co.uk or cagloyd@pkc.gov.uk.
Thanks very much, Danielle. That was a fascinating talk, and I think it's given us a lot of food for thought as we're thinking of developing a project at Lower City Mills here.
All right.
Which is certainly, I think, will be high enough for swifts. It will be interesting to see if we could have any, or we can encourage any. Just for the last few minutes, I'm sure you'd be able to answer any questions that anybody has.
I will try.
Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask Danielle? Either through I don't know if anybody's put any through the chat or live, please just unmute yourselves and go ahead. Kieran.
Hey, Thanks, Danielle. That was really interesting. Found out loads.
Good, you're welcome.
Just wondering, you didn't mention the box that they put in Inchiture Church. Was that successful? Did Swifts come back and live in it then afterwards?
Well, I know that Starlings got in the following year, and I don't know if Swifts have been able to take up residence since. Because Starlings and Swifts, they can fight to the death over a nest site. So if you have a Swift nest box and you're able to get access to it, or any Swift nest site, if you can bung it up with a pair of old socks over the winter, and then just take those socks out, or an old rag or whatever, just take that out, just as the Swifts come back in May, then that's a good way to keep the starlings out. Yeah. I'm not down in Inchiture very, very often these days, so I know certainly the first summer the starlings were in there, so I hope that the Swifts managed to get back in, but I just don't know. I think it's a downside of these Swift projects, is that we need people to keep an eye on the boxes, but it's quite often, you know, people, they're excited to get their boxes up and to think that they might host Swifts, but keeping an eye on them is one of the things that just sort of like falls down the list of priorities.
Mm-hmm. I just thought it was quite elegant being able to integrate it into the roof space like that, so you don't have a foreign object hanging out on the outside at all.
Yeah, definitely, and certainly if it comes to like domestic properties, for example, if they change hands, having an integral nest site, whether it's for Swifts or whether it's for bats, then it's much more likely to continue, you know, throughout different ownership than an external box that somebody, if they don't like it, they would take it off.
You're saying the major loss of those nesting sites is from people sealing up all the gaps for energy efficiency. So if they could be encouraged to seal the gaps but around the little cavity,
exactly,
then that might mitigate that.
And I think you know, people may not know that they've got they may not know that they have bats or Swifts or whatever. So yeah, just I don't know, just having that information there on the website, so people can go and have a look and know what they're looking for, is really useful. The stuff on the Tayside Biodiversity website is really, really handy, so well worth having a look at that.
Mm-hmm.
Do the Swifts prefer sort of a more rural or small environment, or would you find them in the centre of Perth, for example?
Yeah, they're in the centre of Perth. We would love to have a Perth Swift conservation project if we could get the funding. Yeah, they're still in Perth. I mean, the numbers aren't what they used to be. In fact, I was looking through a presentation when I first started as a ranger in Perth and Kinross in 2002, I think it was. And I started working on Swifts quite soon after that, and looking at the maximum numbers in the various towns and villages across Perthshire that I'd put in this presentation, even in the space of 15 years, those numbers have dropped. So yeah, it's something that we're trying our best, but everybody needs to do something to try and help Swifts especially.
Yeah. Do you know what's happening to their habitat in southern Africa? Is that under threat as well?
Yes, well, in southern Africa, obviously there's lots of deforestation going on around about the tropical rainforests, which is one of the areas where they overwinter. There's obviously going to be lots of perils for them in migration. Climate change is just making you know, desertification worse, so that there's obviously less to feed on as they cross over the desert areas. They're quite often caught for food in southern Africa as well. Swifts, swallows, and martins. Yeah, it's just a whole, with loss of nest sites here, not so much to feed on here, and lots of changes going on the migration routes. It's hard. It's very hard for Swifts. So anything we can do to help them can make a big difference, I think.
Food for thought.
I've got another question.
Good. Yeah.
I wonder either or both of you might be able to answer, but do we promote biodiversity measures like nest boxes in CARS or City Heritage Trust schemes nationwide? Is that something that's done?
I don't think so. but I may be wrong.
Well, in fact, since I had my first conversation with you, Danielle, I now put a line in our grant offers drawing attention to grantees that they may have swift nests in their buildings, and that they should, and asking them to check before they embark on any conservation works. Nobody has ever come back to me to say that they have found some.
Yeah.
It would
I just wondered if we make it simple for them as well. Say there are some really easy, cheap solutions that you can do to conserve that population. Then, while people are renovating, they might go for them.
Yeah, it'd be great if you could include a link to some guidance, so that they've maybe got a better idea of what to look for and what they can do. Yeah, that would be perfect.
Yeah, because I am aware that the fact that we're encouraging people to repair their buildings may well be closing up all these nest sites.
Yeah, I do sometimes think that, you know, bigger projects which have to apply for planning permission, well, swifts and bats will be flagged up there, but the smaller scale things, like, I don't know, maybe people just doing repairs to their buildings, that's not going to be flagged up, and that can be having just as big an impact as larger projects, because it's small stuff going on everywhere rather than, you know, fewer large scale projects.
Yeah, and actually that's another link we could put on our website with City Heritage Fund to the Tayside Swifts, to just cover that. That's a good idea. Yeah.
Just noticed there's another question come in the chat there. If you'd like, can you see the chat, Danielle?
I can. Is this from Neil? Thank you. If encouraging more than one species, are there any things regarding sighting we should take note of? You had adjacent bat and bird boxes on one side. Yeah, that's fine. You can put the bat boxes and the swift boxes next to each other. I think there's a site in Stanley where bats and swifts were actually using the same entrance. They obviously weren't roosting in the same place, or nesting and roosting in the same place. But yeah, you could put bat and swift things next to each other. Maybe if you're putting up house martin cups, site them away from where the swift nest box might be, just because I have seen swifts hanging off a house martin nest, and the house martin's getting very agitated, so maybe best to keep them separate. But yeah, bats and swifts together are fine.
Great. Well, if anybody does have any more questions that they think of, I'm sure they could contact you direct, Danielle, through your website, Perthshire Wildlife. And as it's we've got over a few minutes, or maybe just draw this to a close if that's all right, if there are no more questions.
Yep. Well, thanks for having me along.
I'll just draw things to a close then. And just to thank Danielle once again for such an interesting talk. Our next session is on decorative glass in traditional buildings, and there are still places available which are bookable via Eventbrite, so please do join us for that if you can. But for now, thank you for joining us, and special thanks again to Danielle, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.